So to start out today, we'll look at John 12, 2 verses, and they read as follows. But Jesus answered them, saying, "The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain." Now, the Lord Jesus, starting out, says that the hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. And a person not familiar with the Bible might not realize that the Lord is talking about his upcoming death that will be happening quite shortly from when he said this. But no matter how you would take that first sentence of the Lord's, the second sentence is clear. He's talking about what happens to a grain of wheat. If you don't plant it, well, it just stays there, and you can come back a year later and look at it, and it's still just a single grain. But if it falls into the ground and dies, it actually produces much, much more grain. And the Lord is talking about what is going to happen to him, that he is going to die. Now, he doesn't mention in this illustration that he'll be raised again, but he will die and be raised again. But after that, there will come much grain or much result after his death and resurrection and stemming from his death and resurrection. So that's what he's talking about. Now, in the context, he would even go on to apply this principle to those who followed him by saying those who would desire to save their life will lose it, and those who would lose their life for his sake would find it. And that's the same kind of idea that we can apply to our own lives. But for the moment, the Lord is showing what will happen to him, and that is he would be the grain of wheat that would die and would bring forth much grain. So the subject this morning is to take your life seriously. There are ripple effects to the things that we do, actually both in the good and bad direction. So what might seem small at one point has ripple effects that may go on and on and on, farther than we ever imagined. There are propagating effects that take place over time that we need to consider. And as we consider them, it might make us take our life more seriously. So let's look at this verse and what the Lord is saying, that there are propagating effects, there are long-term effects to his death and resurrection. So at one point, Christ dies and is raised. And we'll mark that on our little time chart here. And from the point of his resurrection to the time when we'll say the church begins, and this is when the next phase of God's plan comes into action, there was a 50-day period. And for lack of anything better to call it, I'll say a waiting period, but there were plenty of things going on during that time. The Lord was making appearances to his disciples and to others. And then on the 40th day of this waiting period, the Lord ascended to heaven in a visible way. People watched him. And then 10 more days is when we come to Acts chapter 2, the official beginning of the next phase of God's plan, called the church. This term, the church, is in quotes because I might be using it differently than you're used to thinking about going to church and things like that. But this time period, the next phase, began in Acts chapter 2. Now, since that time, there has been a great amount of propagating or ripple effects, or what the Lord is talking about producing much grain after the grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies. So it actually started on the very day that things began, and we read in the book of Acts that there were 3,000 saved on that day. And you don't have to get too much further into the book of Acts, Acts chapter 4, when the number 5,000 saved is given, and it goes on from there. And in fact, Christianity, or what I'll call Christendom here, which has a true component of truly saved people and sadly a false component, has spread throughout history since. So if we were to ask the words at the top of the screen, did they come true in the life and death of the Lord? And the answer is yes, indeed they came true. The Lord died, and his death brought about so much harvest after that. And the graph just keeps going up and up as time goes on. Now, I'll say a couple of things here. First of all, again, about Christendom. If you remember some time ago, we talked about a parable of the wheat and the tares are fake wheat. So the harvest or the field looks like it has more grain in it than is actually true, because some of it is true wheat and some of it is fake. And the idea is that what is called Christianity today and what has been called Christianity over the centuries has been much bigger than what true Christianity is. So the group of saved people, truly saved people, is smaller than the group of people in the world that call themselves Christians. So Christendom is kind of the whole ball of wax, and there are true and false components. But without wanting to get too detailed into that, I think that we can agree that even the true component has yielded much, much grain, much fruit since the time the Lord died, and that what he said came true exactly. Now, again, before we go on, I'll ask a little puzzling question to you, a little something for you to think about. Would there have been any good that came of Christ's death if no one had ever gotten saved? So just something for you to think about for a moment. Would any good have come from Christ's death if no one had gotten saved? And the answer, by the way, is yes. And it's a little bit of a complicated answer because it has different answers to it. But yes, in one sense, there was a sacrifice to God, his Father, that pleased the Father and pleased heaven, as all the beings of the universe watched what Christ did. So there was that component to it. He was like a burnt offering that brought about a wonderful thing in heaven. So that's one aspect of it. And another is, it, even when God has to judge people who never got saved and judge them for their sins, Christ's death stands as an emblem of his graciousness to mankind. His death stands as a showing of his love and reaching out, even if people reject. So just if no one got saved, it doesn't mean that God didn't love. And if no one got saved, it doesn't mean that God didn't do all he could to reach out to them. So the answer is yes. If no one got saved, his death still would have had value. But let's come back to our subject, and that is the ripple effects. Now, this is very practical to us because our lives have ripple effects as well. They may not be as big as the ripple effects that Christ's life himself had, but they nonetheless may be bigger than we think. I'm going to give you an example of ripple effects over time, and this has to do with a missionary in Syria. Now, I don't know this missionary's name. He lived and did his work over 100 years ago. But his work in Syria led to an evangelistic influence in my grandparents' household. Now, I never met these grandparents, by the way. My dad, who I think is here on the call, knows that. I never met them. But This led to an evangelistic influence in my grandparents' household on my dad's side, where my father grew up. And my father grew up going to an evangelistic church that had been founded by this missionary. And this affected the life of my father. It affected the lives of his children, namely my dad in particular and others, and their children, that would be me, and so on down the line. So my dad came to know the Lord as growing up in Lebanon and Syria, and he came to the United States many decades ago and grew more as a Christian here in the United States, and married and had a family. I'm one of his children, and well, things are going now on a Zoom call on a Saturday study. Now, I want you to think back to that missionary in Syria over a century ago. Did that missionary in Syria have any idea that what he was doing was going to be affecting a Zoom call in the United States in the year 2022? Well, first of all, I don't think he'd know what Zoom was. And I doubt that he was looking forward that much to understand all of the ripple effects over time that would have occurred from his work. But they did occur, and heaven knows it, and he knows it now, I assume. Now, there are examples in the Bible of long-term effects. One of them is something that God said to Abraham. The Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So here is a promise given to Abraham that he would have long-term propagating ripple effects through history. And we see some of these. We see that Abraham's great-grandson named Joseph was in Egypt and ending up saving the known world at the time from famine and starvation. And that is a fascinating story in and of itself. And in that, we see the end of this coming true. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So it came true in some sense with his great-grandson, but that wasn't really the big thing. The real fulfillment of this came centuries later when the Lord Jesus would be born of the line of Abraham. And it would be the Lord Jesus who fulfills these things that we read about being promised to Abraham. So Abraham was going to be the father of a great nation, and he's going to be a father of a nation that in fact would bring about Jesus the Messiah into the world. So think about these promises that were given to Abraham. And I want to ask you, how much of this promise did Abraham himself see? How much of it did Abraham himself see, at least while he was here on earth? Now, Abraham had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob. Now, he would become the father of a nation and blessing to the world. But let's judge nothing before the time. Let's look at what Abraham himself could see. Now, Abraham had only one son that pertained to this promise. He actually had others. Ishmael is of note, but Ishmael was not part of this promise. So concerning this promise, Abraham had only one son. And Isaac, although he had two sons, Jacob and Esau, only one of them pertains to this promise. Esau did not. Now, after Jacob, who is renamed Israel, all of his sons are going to count in terms of this promise and on down the line. But from Abraham, it goes to Isaac and then to Jacob, and then from Jacob, it spreads out. So when Abraham looked at the fulfillment of the promise in his own life, what could he see? Well, that depends on how long he lived. So Abraham was able to see Isaac born. Turns out Abraham was 100 when that happened. And was Abraham able to see Jacob born? And the answer is yes. Jacob was born when Abraham was 160, and Abraham lived to be 175. That left 15 years of overlap. Now, did Abraham actually see Jacob, or did he just overlap in time with him? And the answer is he actually saw him. We read this in Hebrews 11, that they dwelt together in tents. So Abraham enjoyed his time with little grandson Jacob, at least for 15 years until Jacob was 15. But that's all that Abraham saw in his propagation. So if you asked Abraham, well, what did you produce in relation to this promise? And Abraham would just have to say, one. And then if you asked Isaac, well, what did you produce with regard to this promise? Isaac would have to say, one. But after that, we know the story. Jacob went on to have 12 sons and even daughters. And those sons began to multiply to where there was a clan of about 70 that went down to Egypt during a famine. And they dwelt in Egypt, where in Egypt, they went from being a family to being a nation. And on the famous night of the Passover, that nation escaped out of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea. So they went down into Egypt a family, and they exited Egypt as a nation. And the rest is history. Well, literally history. And so even though Abraham in his own life did not see much come of this promise, the ripple effects went on through time, as we know about the nation of Israel, but in particular, the Lord Jesus being born through that nation, and how the Lord Jesus has become a salvation offered to the whole world. Now, within Abraham's life, again, we saw little fruit in terms of his physical line, but that was not the end. And the same is true concerning spiritual fruit in countless lives throughout the centuries of the church. An example of this was a man that I've read about recently named Richard Wurmbrand. I read these little biography stories to my kids. They're written at a level that my kids can enjoy them, and that means that I can enjoy them too, because I think like a kid. And we read them, and this was a fascinating story. He grew up in Romania, started out Jewish, turned atheist, and then turned true born-again Christian, and went on to serve the Lord even under tremendous persecution. Well, this man, I mean, he's led hundreds and hundreds to the Lord, maybe thousands, but he was in Romania, and he went back to the little village that he was saved in. And he was preaching in a little church there, and mentioning that this was the village that he was saved in. Now, he knew the person who led him to the Lord, and he knew that that person had died. So it's not like he was expecting to see that person there or anything. But he talked about how he was saved in that little village and what the Lord did with his life since then. Well, at the back of the church, this man is crying. So at the end of the message, he goes back and he talks to this man. This old man is just crying. And the old man said, "In my whole Christian life, I only saw one person led to the Lord. And I didn't think that person had done much of anything with his life. But that was the person that led you to the Lord. And now I see all the things that God has done through that." So here is an old man, he's about to end his life here below, and he thought his Christian life didn't add up to much in terms of his service. But before he died, God was able to show him that the person he led to the Lord led Richard Wormbrand to the Lord, which led to a great harvest after that. Lots of people coming to know the Lord and serving him and being saved. Just a wonderful story. We can take a look at a man that I and a lot of believers admire a lot. He lived in the 1800s, George Mueller, but he had his own propagating effects of his life. Now, he saw some of these, but he didn't see a lot of them. Here is children in an orphanage that he had been running in Bristol, England. At one point, this orphanage had 2,000 orphans in it. Now, through the years of the orphanage, he and the rest of the staff had cared for 10,000 orphans that came through the orphanage. The highest at one time was about 2,000. And here's a group, I don't know how many are shown here, but must have been one of the larger times of the orphanage. Here's a man who didn't have a dime to his name. And the Lord pressed him and moved him to start this orphanage to address a clear need that he saw in Bristol at the time. Well, he started this orphanage and the Lord just provided, and he kept praying by faith that the Lord would provide his needs. And the Lord did provide in often very miraculous ways. And he even wrote detailed diaries of how the Lord provided and kept track of every penny and every fraction of a penny that they used in those days in keeping track of the expenses and what came in and so on. The building that you see in the background, it still exists today. I physically seen that building. It's not an orphanage for many, many reasons, but the building still exists, and it's being used as, I think, a local college, if I understand right. But what happened was George Mueller had propagating effects. A friend of mine in Wichita, he had a business trip in Bristol some years ago, and he was driven home from the church that he went to, or to his hotel from the church that he went to, by an old man. And the old man said, "Yeah, I was one of George Mueller's orphans in the orphanage." Now, this old man, I think, was there after George Mueller passed away, but it was his orphanage nonetheless. But it had propagating effects. Now, George Mueller wrote these things, and other people in different parts of the world, even as far away as Japan, said, wait a minute, we can do the same thing. And other orphanages began as a result of George Mueller's obeying the Lord and starting his. Hudson Taylor, who went into China and ended up founding China Inland Missions, which has led to thousands upon thousands of souls saved, he was greatly affected by George Mueller and what happened in his orphanages. And he went and visited George Mueller and looked at his life of faith. And he said, I'm going to pattern my life after that example. And that turned out to be tremendous in his own life and how he was able to start China Inland Missions, which has gone on for decades, many, many decades after Hudson Taylor's own ministry. Now, the orphans that were raised in the orphanage, many of them got saved and many went on to have their own ministries. And in George Mueller in his later life was preaching in San Francisco, and somebody came up to him afterwards and said, I'll introduce myself. I was one of your orphans. And George Mueller said, well, what are you doing here? He said, I'm leading a church over here, and this is what's going on. And so he went on to have his own ministry, as did many other orphans. And in Ireland, there was a revival in a place called Ulster. You can look it up. The Ulster revival of 1859 started with a small group of 4 people. It started with one person, but turned into 4 people praying together for revival, for God to do a work in where they were in Ulster. And within 1 year of their seeing the first person saved, within 1 year, the estimates are that 100,000 people came to know the Lord through that revival. It's well documented. You can look up the Ulster revival in Ireland of 1859. But they started by looking at George Mueller and said, we have the same God George Mueller does. And if God answers prayers the way he does for George Mueller, well, then we can pray to that God too. And George Mueller and his orphanages affected me as well. So the propagation is still going on. Now, what's fascinating is these other orphanages, they have their own propagating effects. Hudson Taylor has his own propagating effects. The Orphans Ministries and the Ireland Revival, they all have their own propagating effects, and effects that carry on even until today. So we don't know all of the effects of our decisions. Small though they may be, they might have great ripple effects. And Mueller, he did work building on the foundation of the church. The church in the Bible in that case is likened like a building. So he's building on the foundation in that sense. Now, this cannot be evaluated properly until the end of the church. So I think it won't be until the building is complete. I would think it won't be until the end of the church that would be the right time to have the judgment seat of Christ, when George Mueller's work is evaluated, because it's only then that all the propagating effects will be seen. Now, I want to just give you a really good piece of encouraging news about this. This whole thing didn't start with George Mueller. In fact, there was a man named August Frank that lived over 100 years before the time of George Mueller. And August Frank started an orphanage. It wasn't as big as George Mueller's, but here's a man that's living in the late 1600s, early 1700s, starts an orphanage, and then sees that go on and dies. And one might say, well, yes, there might be some propagating effects there, but really, how long could they last? Well, it turns out that George Mueller, as a young man, ended up staying at a room in that orphanage that was adjacent to the college he was going to. So he stays in this room, and I don't even know if it was still an orphanage at the time, but as a boy, he stays there and he learns that this was an orphanage started by a guy named August Frank, and he finds out a little bit about it. Well, he doesn't think much of it, goes through life until he's at the right point in life, at the right circumstances in Bristol, England, when God presses on George Mueller to start an orphanage. Now, just think about it. George Mueller is being prompted by God to do something. What is he being prompted to do? You can hear it in George Mueller's mind. Are you, Lord, wanting me to start an orphanage the way August Frank did? You see, he was affected by August Frank. And one might look at history, and by the year 1800, one might say, well, all the propagating effects of August Frank's ministry, they're over by now. And little would you know that they're just beginning. So it's just fascinating to think about all the ripple effects that could occur in a person's life. Now, be careful. We've looked at the good side of these ripple effects. Another study could be done looking at the bad side of rippling and propagating effects, because we could say this about bad decisions as well. But for now, we'll take the look only at the good side. And judge nothing before the time. There's a verse in the Bible that says, therefore, judge nothing before the time, until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and will reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. And another similar verse to encourage us, it's in 1 Corinthians 15:58, and it says, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Our work is not going to come to nothing. And I think we've seen that in many ripple effects over time. So with that, we'll stop sharing and open things up to the gathered group. You know the routine by now, so we'll just open things up.